The bridge was never meant to be held by one man. It was a modest span of reinforced concrete crossing a narrow Dutch canal on the eastern edge of the town, part of a larger plan that had already begun to unravel before the first shots were fired. By the time the British platoon reached it, the morning air was thick with smoke from burning houses and the brittle echo of rifle fire ricocheting down cobbled streets. Operation Market Garden had promised speed, surprise, and relief from the grinding stalemate in Western Europe. Instead, it delivered isolation. Radio contact was unreliable. Reinforcements were delayed. German armor, not supposed to be there, had appeared where intelligence said there would be none. And in the center of it all stood a single bridge that mattered far more than its size suggested. It was a choke point, a hinge in a collapsing door. If it fell intact into German hands, the road beyond would open. If it was destroyed too soon, British units already across would be cut off completely. So the platoon was ordered to hold it long enough for clarity to arrive, for orders to stabilize, for something to make sense. They dug in along the embankment and behind low stone walls, Bren guns positioned to cover both approaches. For a few hours they held. Then the German counterattack came in waves, deliberate and methodical, artillery probing first, then infantry advancing in tight coordination. Shells struck the canal banks, sending fountains of mud and water into the air. The first section on the western flank took a direct hit. The second was overrun when ammunition ran dry. By mid-afternoon, the embankment was a broken line of craters and fallen men, and the bridge, still intact, stood exposed in a haze of drifting smoke. Sergeant Thomas Hale of the 1st Airborne Division had watched it happen in increments. He had watched the Bren gunner beside him fall forward without a sound. He had watched a corporal try to drag a wounded private to cover and collapse halfway there. He had counted rounds in his head as carefully as he counted the seconds between artillery impacts. And when the last surviving member of his section went silent, Hale found himself alone on the eastern approach, the bridge stretching behind him like an unfinished sentence. There had been no dramatic realization, no shouted declaration, just absence. The absence of return fire, the absence of familiar voices, the absence of orders. The German infantry, cautious now, had begun to test the approach, moving from doorway to doorway, rifles angled low but ready. Hale shifted position behind the shattered parapet and checked his ammunition. 3 full magazines for his Lee Enfield, 1 half empty. 2 grenades, pistol with limited rounds. He could see the canal water below, disturbed by falling debris. He could hear the low mechanical growl of something heavier moving somewhere beyond the houses. Perhaps half-tracks, perhaps armor. The larger battle had moved beyond his sight, but the bridge remained. It was not heroism that kept him there. It was instruction, habit, and something colder. The knowledge that if he left, the German advance would accelerate. The span was narrow, could be covered by one man for a time. He adjusted his position, sighted down the rifle, and waited for the first figure to commit to the crossing. The wind carried the smell of cordite and masonry dust. A German soldier broke cover, running low along the canal wall. Hale fired once. The recoil was sharp and familiar. The soldier fell forward into the grass. The echo lingered longer than the shot itself. More movement followed. Hale fired again, and again. Not rapidly, not wildly measured, disciplined. Each round was placed with care. The bridge, from the German perspective, was still defended by an unknown number of British troops. That uncertainty was his only ally. Minutes stretched. Hale changed position frequently, firing from different angles to create the illusion of multiple defenders. He allowed silence to hang between shots, forcing the attackers to second-guess what lay ahead. Twice, grenades were thrown toward his last known location, fragments biting into the stone and peppering his sleeve. He did not shout. He did not call for aid. There was no one to hear him. The late afternoon light began to fade, turning the canal a darker shade of gray. Smoke drifted lower, flattening sound and narrowing vision. Somewhere behind him, deeper in town, British units were withdrawing under pressure, reorganizing or breaking entirely. He could not know which. All he knew was that the bridge had not yet been taken. German infantry continued to test it, and each time they did, Hale answered with a single crack of rifle fire. The rhythm became mechanical. Breathe, squeeze, shift, listen. The fallen platoon lay scattered along the embankment behind him, their presence both burden and anchor. The plan had called for coordination, for relief columns racing north. Instead, it had come down to one man with a rifle on a structure that was never meant to be symbolic. The bridge did not know it was important. It did not know that its concrete surface was now the thin line between delay and breakthrough. It simply stood, as Hale stood, absorbing the weight placed upon it. And as dusk settled in, with ammunition steadily diminishing and German patience thinning, the question was no longer whether the bridge would eventually fall, but how long one British sergeant could make it wait. Darkness did not bring relief. It brought calculation. The fading light reduced visibility for both sides, but it favored the attacker's patience over the defender's clarity. Sergeant Hale understood that the illusion he had carefully constructed through the afternoon, multiple rifles firing from shifting angles, the appearance of a reinforced position, would not hold indefinitely. German reconnaissance units were methodical. They would probe. They would listen. They would measure the rhythm of resistance. Already, the pauses between his shots had lengthened, not from indecision but from necessity. Ammunition was no longer a reserve. It was arithmetic. He stripped the half-empty magazine from his pouch and consolidated loose rounds, fingers steady despite the tremor of exhaustion beginning to creep into his wrists. His throat was dry from powder and dust. The bridge, once a clear span of concrete, had become a corridor of shadow interrupted by the pale gleam of the canal below. Somewhere across the water, a German voice issued a brief command, clipped and precise. Hale did not speak German, but the tone required no translation. They were reorganizing. The first flare rose without warning. A white arc climbed above the rooftops and burst, bathing the canal in a stark, surgical light. The shadows fled. The embankment, littered with the bodies of his platoon, stood exposed in merciless clarity. Hale flattened himself against the broken parapet, feeling fragments of stone press into his cheek. He did not fire. He allowed the flare to burn out without response, counting its seconds, mapping in his mind what the Germans would have seen. One position, perhaps two. No sustained fire. No movement beyond a single locus. The illusion was thinning. When darkness returned, it was thicker than before. A machine gun opened from the far side, stitching the parapet with controlled bursts. Chips of concrete struck Hale's helmet, and one round grazed his sleeve, hot and immediate. He shifted again, crawling several yards along the embankment, ignoring the sting in his forearm. He would have to shorten the distance, force the engagement closer, where numbers mattered less than angle and nerve. The next attempt came cautiously. 3 figures advanced low along the canal wall, using the lip of stone as partial cover. Hale waited until they were nearly halfway across the span. The range had closed to less than 50 yards. He exhaled slowly and fired. The lead figure dropped. The others scattered, returning fire in sharp, urgent bursts. Hale rolled to his left and threw one of his grenades not toward the men themselves but toward the far edge of the bridge, where it would suggest a secondary position. The explosion cracked against the canal walls, echoing in the confined space. For a moment, the German advance stalled again. Confusion was still his ally, but fatigue was accumulating in layers. His shoulders ached from holding the rifle steady for hours. The smell of cordite clung to him. Beneath it all was a quieter sensation, the weight of being the last. It was not grief in the immediate sense. There had been no time for that. It was awareness. Each man behind him had fallen performing the same task. Delay. That responsibility had not diminished with their absence. It had intensified. Hale allowed himself one brief glance over his shoulder at the empty stretch of road leading back into town. No movement, no headlights, no signal of reinforcement. The larger plan had dissolved into fragments of resistance scattered across Arnhem, and this bridge was one such fragment. Another flare rose, this one followed by mortar fire. The rounds landed short at first, then crept forward in deliberate increments. The Germans were walking the barrage toward him. Hale withdrew several yards further back along the embankment, choosing a final defensible angle where the bridge narrowed slightly before meeting the road. If they reached this point in force, he would not have the space to maneuver. He checked his remaining ammunition. 1 full magazine, perhaps 15 loose rounds. 1 grenade left. The pistol, untouched until now, felt almost ceremonial in its weight. He did not consider surrender. Not from ideology, not from anger, but from calculation. The time bought thus far had meaning beyond the canal. Every additional minute forced German units to commit resources here rather than elsewhere. Every delay introduced friction into their timetable. When the next wave came, it came faster. A half-track engine growled in the darkness, edging toward the bridge mouth but stopping short of committing to the span. Infantry surged ahead of it, using the renewed mortar cover to mask their approach. Hale fired rapidly now, the measured rhythm replaced by necessity. 1 figure fell, then another. Return fire tore through the parapet, shattering what remained of its cover. Stone fragments cut into his neck. He pulled the final grenade, waited a heartbeat longer than instinct advised, and hurled it low across the concrete. The blast erupted near the front rank of the advancing infantry, scattering them again. But this time the hesitation was shorter. German soldiers had begun to sense the truth. The resistance was thinning to a single origin point. Hale felt the recoil of his rifle one last time as the final magazine emptied. The click that followed was small but definitive. He did not attempt to reload immediately. Instead, he drew the pistol and shifted slightly to his right, creating one more illusion of depth. The Germans were within 20 yards now. In the intermittent flashes of gunfire, he could see faces. Young, strained, determined. The distance had collapsed from abstraction to proximity. This was no longer about holding a structure. It was about occupying a space in time. He fired the pistol deliberately, each shot placed, each movement restrained. The half-track engine revved again but did not advance. The uncertainty remained just enough. Then, from somewhere beyond the houses to his rear, came the sound he had not expected. British artillery. Not heavy, sustained bombardment, just a sudden, precise salvo striking the western approach to the bridge. The rounds landed behind the German position, cutting off the infantry from the half-track and throwing the canal edge into chaos. The timing was imperfect but decisive. German soldiers dove for cover. The engine noise retreated. Hale did not know whether the artillery had been redirected intentionally to relieve him or whether it was coincidence born of broader maneuvers. He did not need to know. The bridge was still not taken. As the smoke thickened again and the German advance faltered, Hale finally allowed himself to sink back against the shattered parapet. His hearing rang. His vision narrowed slightly at the edges. The bridge remained intact, scarred but standing. Behind him, in the town, the larger withdrawal was consolidating. Minutes had become hours. Hours had shifted the shape of the engagement. The question had changed. It was no longer how long one man could hold the bridge. It was how long the bridge, held by one man, had held the enemy. The night was not over. The battle was not finished. But for that interval, measured in flares, in spent cartridges, in breaths taken between shots, the British sergeant had altered the tempo of a German advance. And in war, tempo is sometimes the difference between collapse and endurance. The artillery that had scattered the German advance did not continue. It arrived in a brief, controlled pattern. 4 rounds, perhaps 5. Then silence returned as abruptly as it had been broken. In that silence, Sergeant Hale understood something fundamental about the larger battle. The guns were not there for him. They were firing along a broader axis, adjusting to threats unseen from his vantage point. The bridge was only one coordinate among many. Yet for those few moments, the shells had accomplished what rifle fire alone could not. They disrupted certainty. German infantry withdrew to regroup, dragging their wounded back across the canal approach. The half-track reversed fully out of sight. Smoke thickened again, settling into the low ground near the water and clinging to the stonework like a second skin. Hale did not mistake this withdrawal for defeat. He had seen too much of the day's fighting to indulge that illusion. The Germans would return. They would come with heavier weapons or with a flanking maneuver through adjacent streets. They would test the northern bank or attempt to force the canal downstream. The bridge remained strategically valuable not because of its width but because of its timing. Market Garden's promise had hinged on sequential captures. Bridges taken intact, roads opened rapidly, armor pushed through before the enemy reorganized. That clock had already faltered elsewhere. Here, at this modest span of concrete, time itself had become the only objective still intact. Hale pressed his sleeve against the shallow wound on his forearm and flexed his fingers to test his grip. The sting was sharp but manageable. He reloaded the Lee Enfield with the loose rounds he had consolidated earlier, seating them carefully into the magazine. 12 rounds remained. The pistol lay empty beside him. He reholstered it without ceremony. His helmet had been chipped by concrete fragments, its rim bent slightly from the impact of shrapnel. He adjusted it by instinct rather than comfort. Beneath the helmet, beneath the uniform stiff with dust and sweat, was fatigue. Deep, unadorned fatigue that crept not as panic but as gravity. From across the canal, German movement resumed more cautiously. This time they did not attempt a direct rush. Instead, probing fire came from side streets, angled toward his known positions. A machine gun was set up in an upper window overlooking part of the span, its muzzle flashes brief and disciplined. Hale shifted lower, flattening himself behind the embankment, minimizing silhouette. He fired only once in response, just enough to signal presence, not enough to expose rhythm. The German approach adapted. Smoke grenades rolled onto the bridge, spreading a gray veil that distorted distance and direction. He understood the tactic immediately, reduce the advantage of his measured fire, force him into closer engagement where numbers could finally assert themselves. Hale did not fire into the smoke blindly. Instead, he listened. Boots on concrete sounded different from boots on cobble. The bridge surface carried vibration along its length. He waited until he felt, rather than saw, movement commit to the span. Then he rose slightly, fired twice into the densest portion of the haze, and shifted back again before returning fire stitched the parapet. Minutes passed in this exchange of inference. A soldier advanced too far into the smoke and fell. Another shouted sharply in German before silence reclaimed him. The machine gun in the upper window adjusted its angle, attempting to suppress what it believed were multiple British positions. Hale used that miscalculation carefully, firing from one edge of the embankment, then crawling several yards to fire from another. He had long since abandoned the idea of survival as a certainty. Now he worked toward survival as delay. Behind him, faint but distinct, came the sound of British movement within the town. Vehicles repositioning, stretcher-bearers moving the wounded, officers shouting terse commands. The withdrawal was stabilizing. The larger formation was not collapsing outright. It was consolidating under pressure. That knowledge, even without direct confirmation, altered his posture. The bridge no longer needed to be held indefinitely. It needed to be held until order reasserted itself elsewhere. A sharper report cracked from across the canal, a sniper this time, not a rifleman advancing. The round struck the parapet inches from Hale's head, showering him with dust. He rolled instinctively to his right. A second shot followed, more precise. The Germans had identified his approximate position and introduced a countermeasure. Hale adjusted accordingly, retreating several yards further back along the embankment to a section where the concrete curved slightly inward, creating a shallow recess. From there, he could still cover the narrowest portion of the span while presenting less exposure to the elevated shooter. The canal water below reflected faint starlight between drifting smoke. Hale became aware of how still the surface had grown, disturbed only occasionally by falling debris. War at a distance is often described in movement. Advances, retreats, offensives, but here on the bridge it had become about stillness, about patience, about who would commit first. The Germans attempted one more coordinated push before midnight. Under the cover of renewed mortar fire, 3 squads advanced simultaneously, one directly across the bridge, one attempting to skirt the canal edge to the south, and one providing suppressive fire from the upper window. Hale recognized the pattern quickly. If the southern element reached the far embankment unchallenged, they could enfilade his position. He shifted his fire accordingly, prioritizing the flanking movement. 2 well-placed shots disrupted their advance, forcing them to ground. He then redirected toward the central push, firing deliberately into the lead figures before ducking low as return fire struck the parapet. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes but felt suspended outside measurable time. When it ended, the German units again withdrew, this time more decisively. The mortar fire ceased. The machine gun in the window fell silent. The smoke began to dissipate in the cooler air of night. Hale did not rise in triumph. He remained prone, rifle steady, breathing slow and controlled. He understood that such withdrawals often signaled not abandonment but recalibration. The bridge had not been taken. It had not been destroyed. It remained a contested object in a contested city. Yet its defense by a single British sergeant had extended beyond expectation. He glanced once more over his shoulder. In the distance, British armored vehicles were moving through the town in organized formation, withdrawal yes but orderly. The line had not shattered completely. The time bought at the bridge had folded into that outcome, invisible but consequential. The night air cooled against his skin. Ammunition remained limited. The Germans would likely resume at first light, perhaps with heavier support. Hale adjusted his grip on the rifle and settled back into position. The bridge still stood. So did he. The first light did not arrive gently. It seeped into the canal like diluted ash, turning smoke into pale ribbons and exposing the geometry of destruction that darkness had concealed. The town behind Sergeant Hale bore the shape of withdrawal. Vehicles moving in staggered columns, wounded carried across improvised stretchers, officers speaking in clipped tones that betrayed exhaustion more than fear. The British had not collapsed outright. They had contracted, consolidating around defensible streets further west. The bridge, however, remained forward of that line, a protruding fragment of yesterday's objective that now carried disproportionate weight. Hale understood before the first German shell landed that daylight would change the nature of the fight. Illusion thrives in darkness. Morning invites verification. The initial artillery strike was precise. 2 rounds landed short of the eastern embankment, testing distance. A third walked forward and struck the parapet where Hale had first positioned himself the previous afternoon, collapsing what remained of its cover. Concrete disintegrated into the canal below. Hale had already shifted position before the impact, but the message was unmistakable. The Germans had recalculated overnight. They were no longer guessing at the number of defenders. They were determining the structure's tolerances. A machine gun resumed fire from the same upper window across the canal, this time joined by another further north. Interlocking fields were forming. The bridge was being prepared for systematic reduction. Hale lay low behind the shallow recess he had identified in darkness, allowing the barrage to pass overhead. His rifle rested steady against his shoulder. 12 rounds remained, now reduced to 11 after a probing shot at a figure adjusting a mortar tube across the water. He did not aim to eliminate entire squads. He aimed to interrupt coordination. A single disrupted movement could delay a push by minutes. Minutes were the only currency left. German infantry advanced cautiously behind a renewed smoke screen, but this time their spacing was disciplined and their suppression fire continued. Hale felt the calculus shift. Yesterday, the bridge had been defended by the uncertainty of numbers. Today, it was defended by obstruction alone. He fired at the first soldier who broke through the smoke at midspan, then shifted immediately to the southern flank where movement along the canal edge resumed. The Lee Enfield's recoil had grown heavier in his arms, not physically, but perceptually. Each shot carried the weight of finality. 8 rounds remained. Behind him, a British armored car attempted to reposition near a side street leading toward the bridge. German artillery adjusted almost instantly. A shell struck near its rear axle, disabling it before it could contribute meaningful fire. The crew scrambled out under cover and withdrew on foot. Hale registered the event without anger. He had ceased to evaluate outcomes emotionally. The bridge would not be reinforced directly. It would be contested until either the Germans seized it intact or the British command chose to deny it entirely. The choice arrived without ceremony. A runner, young, mud-streaked, breathing in short bursts, reached Hale's position just after the smoke thinned briefly. The man crouched low, speaking rapidly. Orders had come down. The bridge was to be destroyed if it could no longer be held. Demolition charges had been placed at the central support during the initial occupation. The detonation wire ran back toward the town, but the ignition point had been compromised during the night's fighting. Someone would need to reach the central pier, confirm the charges were intact, and manually trigger them if the German advance became irreversible. Hale did not hesitate. The arithmetic was clear. If the bridge fell intact, German armor would exploit the crossing before British consolidation stabilized. If the bridge was destroyed prematurely, British units east of the canal would be cut off entirely. The timing would determine whether destruction was sacrifice or necessity. He handed the runner his final full magazine and instructed him to return to the secondary line. The young soldier hesitated, glancing at the expanse of exposed concrete between them and the canal's midpoint. Hale offered no speech. He simply rose. The movement was not theatrical. It was procedural. Hale advanced low along the eastern edge of the bridge, using the parapet as partial cover while machine gun fire stitched the surface inches from his boots. German infantry surged again, emboldened by the daylight and the reduction in defensive fire. Hale fired twice while moving, each shot intended not to eliminate but to suppress. The sound of bullets striking concrete echoed sharply in the confined space. Halfway across, a mortar round landed near the southern lip of the span, throwing Hale against the parapet. His helmet was torn free. His hearing dimmed momentarily to a distant hum. He forced himself upright and continued. The canal water below churned from falling debris. Smoke thickened again, not from grenades but from ruptured masonry and burning timber drifting from nearby houses. He reached the central pier where the demolition charges had been placed the previous day. The wiring was partially exposed, insulation stripped by shrapnel. One of the charges had shifted slightly but remained lodged against the support column. Hale knelt beside it, hands steady despite the tremor now overtaking his shoulders. German infantry were within 30 yards, their movement visible through gaps in the smoke. He adjusted the wiring quickly, reconnecting what fragments had been severed. He did not look back toward the eastern embankment. He knew what he would see. No line of British infantry, no covering fire, only the fading remnants of a position that had already fulfilled its purpose. A German voice shouted sharply from the far side. Footsteps pounded onto the bridge. Hale completed the final connection and drew the manual igniter from his pouch. For a brief second, the noise of the battle narrowed into something almost distant. He was aware of the bridge's surface beneath his boots, of the canal's current below, of the smoke drifting upward into a pale sky. The structure had been held longer than expected. It had delayed the advance. It had absorbed hours that would not be returned to the German timetable. He pulled the igniter. The explosion did not produce a cinematic fireball. It produced a concussive fracture, a tearing of concrete and steel that split the bridge at its midpoint. The central support collapsed inward, dragging sections of the span down into the canal. German soldiers nearest the blast were thrown backward or into the water below. Smoke and dust engulfed the area in a choking cloud. Hale was thrown against the parapet once more, this time with greater force. When the debris settled enough for orientation, the bridge no longer connected both banks. A jagged gap now separated east from west, impassable to armor and difficult even for infantry. British artillery resumed seconds later, this time concentrated along the western approach, sealing the newly created rupture. German forces withdrew beyond immediate crossing distance, forced to recalibrate yet again. Hale did not rise immediately. He remained seated against the shattered parapet, ears ringing, vision blurred by dust and concussion. The structure he had defended no longer existed in its former shape. The objective had shifted from holding to denying, and that, too, had been accomplished. Across the canal, the German movement stalled definitively. The crossing was gone. The timetable fractured with it. The bridge had fallen, but not to them. When the dust settled enough for the shape of the canal to return, the bridge no longer resembled a span at all. It was a broken geometry of concrete teeth jutting from either bank. The central section collapsed into the slow-moving water below. The German advance, so deliberate through the morning, had been forced into pause, not by superior numbers or a fresh British line, but by subtraction. The crossing had ceased to exist. Sergeant Hale remained seated against the eastern parapet for several moments, not from indecision but from the physical weight of concussion pressing inward on his senses. His hearing returned first as a distant metallic ringing, then gradually as the layered noise of artillery and shouted commands reassembled into coherence. He tested his hands. They trembled slightly but obeyed. His rifle lay beside him, its wood darkened by dust and smoke. The structure he had been ordered to hold, and then to deny, was gone. The objective had shifted twice within 24 hours, from possession to delay, from delay to destruction. Each shift had demanded a narrowing of responsibility until only one figure remained on the eastern bank. British units withdrew methodically from adjacent streets as artillery fire covered their movement. The line, though battered, had reformed further west along defensible ground. The gap in the bridge forced German forces to redirect armor and infantry through alternate crossings miles away, adding friction to an already congested operational plan. In war, minutes do not appear dramatic in isolation. They accumulate quietly, altering decisions far beyond the field of view of the individual soldier. The hours purchased at that canal, measured in rifle shots, flares, smoke, and a final detonator, became part of a larger calculus shaping the withdrawal from Arnhem. Medics reached Hale shortly after midday. They examined the shallow shrapnel wound on his forearm and the deeper bruising across his ribs where blast force had thrown him against the parapet. He did not describe what had occurred in grand terms. There had been no speech, no declaration of final stands. Platoon had fallen. A bridge had remained contested. A decision had been executed. That was the language he understood: procedural, contained, precise. In the days that followed, reports would note the destruction of the crossing as a tactical denial preventing immediate German exploitation. The bridge would be listed among many that defined the struggle around Arnhem. Some captured, some held briefly, some lost, some destroyed. It would not carry the name of a single defender in official summaries. Yet, within the smaller circles of the 1st Airborne Division, the account traveled differently. Men who had regrouped west of the canal understood that the German delay had not occurred by accident. They knew that someone had remained forward of the withdrawal line longer than doctrine required. They knew that the explosion had come at the precise moment when collapse would have meant pursuit. Sergeant Hale was evacuated later that evening as the British perimeter contracted further under pressure. The campaign would not unfold as originally planned. Market Garden would be remembered for its overreach, its miscalculations, and the brutal fighting that followed. The bridge at Arnhem would enter history not as a symbol of victory but as part of a costly lesson about speed, intelligence, and resistance. Yet within that larger narrative of operational strain, there remained smaller acts that reshape tempo without altering headlines. A bridge is a structure designed to connect. In this case, its final service was interrupted. It delayed the movement of armor, disrupted a timetable, and forced recalculation. It did so not through abstraction but through the presence of a single British sergeant who stood alone after the platoon fell, who measured ammunition in breaths, and who understood that denial could be as decisive as defense. The canal resumed its ordinary rhythm within weeks. Debris was cleared. Temporary crossings were erected. The war advanced elsewhere. But for one night and one morning in Arnhem, the span between two banks became the boundary between momentum and hesitation. And on that boundary, a British sergeant remained until there was no bridge left to hold.